World War II would be won by the intelligence of the British, the steel of the Americans, and the blood of the Russians. That was the prophecy made by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943, one that became reality just 2 years later. But in an alternate reality where the United States remained neutral, would this still have been the outcome of the war? Or would the Nazi flag have flown across the world? Let us turn back time to the 1930s. At this point, a new ideology had emerged in Europe, threatening global peace: fascism. Although it was cleverly masked by Führer Adolf Hitler as the last dam, holding back the tide of communism, it was not hard to see through it. Just shortly before, this very man had delivered passionate speeches about anti-Semitism, reviving the greatness of the German nation and the necessity of constantly expanding the military. It was clear that the old continent was soon to face another war. Therefore, on the other side of the globe, the United States once again found itself caught between two choices: to join its allies in confronting this new threat, or to remain neutral and let the European nations deal with the issue on their own. And having already endured the horrors of the First World War, where American soldiers had shed their blood on a land thousands of miles away, and now facing the devastating aftermath of the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, the land of the Stars and Stripes was clearly not enthusiastic about the idea of entering another conflict. Moreover, the United States' prime geographic location, between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, along with one of the most powerful naval forces at the time, made any invasion attempt nearly impossible. This led the majority of Americans to believe that isolationism was the key to keeping the country out of another war. In fact, in our timeline, a 1940 survey showed that about 88% of Americans were against the idea of joining the war against fascism in Europe. This sentiment only changed after the disaster at Pearl Harbor. Therefore, on August 31, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Neutrality Act into law, describing it as an expression of the nation's desire to avoid any action that could drag the United States into another devastating conflict. However, unlike in our timeline, where, despite neutrality, Washington still supported the Allied powers through the Lend-Lease program, thereby indirectly becoming an enemy of the Axis, in this alternate scenario, the U.S. provided no aid to either side. This allowed Hitler to achieve what he had always hoped for after witnessing the downfall of the German Empire in World War I: keeping the American Empire out of the war. Ironically, this would become one of the greatest mistakes made by the Führer, at least in our world. But even after that goal was achieved, could the ambitions of this mad dictator truly be realized? Just like in our actual timeline, America's absence in the early stages of the war would hardly alter the course of events. Nazi Germany would still invade Poland, thereby triggering the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history. Things would only begin to diverge significantly in 1940, when France, overly confident in its Maginot Line defenses, was crushed by Germany in just 49 days. At that point, the only remaining Allied power capable of resisting the Third Reich's advance through Western Europe was the United Kingdom. The situation was especially dire, as not long before, Britain had suffered a humiliating defeat at Dunkirk. If not for strategic missteps by the Germans and the arrogance of Hermann Göring, who believed that the Luftwaffe alone could prevent any escape, it's very possible that fish and chips could have been replaced by beer and sausages. Yet, even if Germany had prevailed on land, invading Britain at that time was nearly impossible. Despite losing its crucial ally France, the Royal Navy still vastly outmatched Hitler's Kriegsmarine. Even Nazi Germany's Grand Admiral Erich Raeder once candidly admitted, "Our navy is merely a cheap imitation of Britain's. The ships are unprepared for action and lie dead in the harbors, as useless as a pile of scrap metal." Despite the United Kingdom having to defend vast maritime territories, especially vital sea lanes that transported resources from colonies to fuel the domestic war industry, as well as supply routes to Egypt to counter the Axis forces in North Africa, the Royal Navy still held a decisive advantage over the Axis powers, both in quantity and quality of ships. Whether or not the U.S. provided aid, Britain's navy could have prevailed, if not outright dominated, the Axis at sea. A prime example is the Battle of Taranto, where the Italian navy suffered the wrath of the British. However, back home in Britain, the story was very different. Take a look at the screen. Through the Lend-Lease program, The financial aid provided by the United States accounted for over 10% of Britain's total wartime expenditure. It's no surprise, then, that the British economy would have faced severe hardships without support from Washington, especially in maintaining food supplies, as well as producing and repairing mechanical equipment. Britain faced great difficulty as its industrial zones were continuously bombed by Germany. But would the island nation of Mist surrender so easily? The answer, of course, is no. Just like in our real timeline, the leader of Britain at the time was Winston Churchill, a tough and resolute figure from the Conservative Party. And as long as he remained in power, London would fight to the end, even in the face of peace offers from Nazi Germany. Moreover, despite the lack of American aid, the Royal Air Force, RAF, still held a critical strategic advantage: the radar network. With this system, the RAF could detect and intercept German aircraft before they reached their targets. Combined with Britain's domestic production capacity, they were still capable of preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority. This situation only began to shift around 1942, when the Third Reich, thanks to access to mineral resources from occupied territories, was finally able to accelerate research and mass-produce advanced fighter planes like the Messerschmitt Me 262 and the Horten Ho 229, which had previously been delayed. However, even with air superiority, conquering Britain required control of the English Channel, and that's where the Royal Navy would ensure that the Kriegsmarine, German Navy, met total defeat if it attempted a crossing. Thus, at this moment, Adolf Hitler's attention temporarily turned eastward, with hopes of recreating what Napoleon Bonaparte had once tried to do: burn Russia to ashes. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, initiating the largest land invasion in history, targeting the Soviet Union. Despite possessing elite forces and executing blitzkrieg tactics, striking fast, pushing deep, and occupying vast territories, as many military strategists have remarked, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Germany advanced too quickly and too deeply, outpacing its supply lines. This severely weakened frontline combat effectiveness. By late 1941, Russia's most legendary ally throughout history arrived: the winter. The same winter that broke Napoleon's army now crushed Hitler's expeditionary forces under snow, starvation, and exhaustion. At this point, Germany turned to its eastern ally, Japan. However, up to this moment, Japan had not given the United States any justification for entering the war. In this alternate timeline, with the U.S. embracing full isolationism, refusing to trade with any belligerent and abstaining from asserting influence in Asia, Japan had no reason to attack Pearl Harbor, the very event that, in real history, drew Washington into World War II. Even with the American threat out of the picture, Japan was in no position to provide immediate military support to the Third Reich. Japan was already entangled in conflicts against Britain and the Netherlands in Asia, while also needing to swiftly conquer China and seize its vast natural resources to sustain its war machine. Furthermore, with nearly the entire defense budget allocated to the Navy, Japan's Army and Air Force were vastly inferior to the still mighty Red Army. Thus, declaring war on Moscow for the sake of a not-so-close ally would have been a strategic blunder. Instead, Japan chose to expand its influence across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, aiming to cut off vital supply routes from British colonies, such as India, New Zealand, and Australia, routes that led directly to the United Kingdom. They also eyed the invasion of other territories, such as the Philippines. Unlike the Kriegsmarine, which lagged far behind the Royal Navy in nearly every category, except submarines, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a formidable force, capable of dominating the Pacific and challenging the British Empire at sea. Looking at real history, we can see that by the latter years of the war, Japan actually surpassed Britain in the production of certain warships, even while being bombarded by the United States. So in this timeline, free from American interference, Japan's use of sheer numbers to gain naval dominance becomes all the more plausible, especially since most Japanese warships were sunk not by the British, but by the U.S. Navy. And not just in the Pacific. In the Atlantic, Germany had launched nearly 1,200 U-boats, with over two-thirds destroyed by the U.S. Navy, while Britain managed to sink only around 300. The absence of American sea power was a devastating blow to the Allied cause. As sea control slipped away, the nightmare began for Britain. From 1942 onward, the lack of American involvement made everything drastically worse for the Allies. Britain not only endured relentless bombing raids from the Luftwaffe, but also faced a severe food shortage. Worse still, with supply routes from its colonies disrupted, the UK's ability to repair and manufacture military equipment sharply declined. As a result, a full-scale invasion of the British Isles, once just a theoretical plan known as Operation Sea Lion, now became a real and terrifying possibility. However, in order to knock Britain out of the war, Germany would have to redirect its elite forces westward. But doing so would be akin to leaving its back exposed to a rapidly recovering Red Army. Thus, Hitler was left with only two options: either conquer the Red Empire entirely or force the Soviets into a truce, allowing Germany to redirect its focus toward the Western Front. However, after the failure of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, achieving either goal became increasingly unrealistic. There is an often overlooked fact. The United States played a massive role in helping the Soviet Union win the Great Patriotic War. Nearly 500,000 trucks and jeeps, over 27,000 tanks and aircraft, 4 million tons of food, and countless supplies were shipped from Washington to Moscow. Without this support, more Soviet workers would have been tied up in production rather than sent to the front lines. So, could the USSR collapse under the might of the Third Reich? The short answer is no. Even if Hitler launched multiple invasions or managed to persuade Japan to attack from the east, forcing the Soviets to split their forces across two fronts, the Red Empire was simply too vast to be strangled by the Nazi pincer. With immense natural resources and a fully mobilized wartime economy, the Kremlin could outproduce the Axis powers in tanks, aircraft, and other military hardware. But production alone would not be enough to defeat Nazi Germany. In our timeline, one of the key reasons Germany lost the Eastern Front was due to massive Allied counteroffensives in North Africa, which reopened the Western Front. This forced Germany to pull troops from the Soviet front to defend against new threats. Now, without American troops or logistical aid, Britain, long stuck in a defensive posture, would find it nearly impossible to launch any meaningful counterattacks. Worse yet, with the Royal Navy weakened, Germany and Italy could very well seize the island of Malta after years of siege. If Malta fell, it would sever the Allies' critical supply line to North Africa, crippling not only troop deployments but also any hope of future counteroffensives in the region. And once the Axis powers secured near-total control of the Mediterranean, it became only a matter of time before the defeat of the Allied forces in Africa. Just as in our own timeline, there would still be scattered counterattacks by the Allies against the German-Italian forces in North Africa. A few territories might be reclaimed briefly, but they would soon fall back into Axis hands, thanks to swift and decisive offensives led by the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. Moreover, without the United States, a key player in the Second Battle of El Alamein, organizing a large-scale counteroffensive became nearly impossible, let alone reopening a new front in Europe. To make matters worse, Italy, often seen as the opportunist prince in global politics, had no reason to betray the Axis at this point in time. This was truly a once-in-a-millennium opportunity for Nazi Germany to achieve what it had always desired, to force all of Europe to its knees under fascist rule. However, a new challenge now confronted the Third Reich: manpower. After nearly 6 years of total war, approximately 22% of Germany's population had already been mobilized to serve Hitler's ambitions. And now, the Reich simply lacked enough young men to continue waging full-scale war. On the other side, the Soviet Union fared little better. The prolonged conflict had forced Moscow to conscript up to 26% of its total population. At this point, both Berlin and Moscow understood that if the war dragged on, it would evolve into a brutal war of attrition, one with catastrophic losses and no clear victor in sight. After years of waging war across the frozen expanse of Russia, the German high command finally came to a grim realization. Conquering the Soviet Union was simply impossible. The brutal winters and the unyielding spirit of the Russian people had turned the land into a graveyard for invaders. Even if a single Soviet tank was destroyed, 5 more would appear the next day, ready to retaliate. With a vast industrial base relocated deep within its heartland, the USSR could replenish its forces endlessly, so long as it maintained its interior defenses. Yet, the Soviets also understood a harsh truth. While they could defend and even counterattack, launching an all-out offensive into German territory, especially now that the Reich was far stronger than in real history, was out of the question without Western aid. Operations such as Leningrad and Novgorod, though they struck heavy blows to German Army Group North, came at a tremendous cost. Soviet losses were over 4 times higher, even when they had a 60% numerical advantage. In the end, both sides knew the other could turn at any moment. Thus, a new non-aggression pact would emerge between East and West, a pragmatic truce to serve both their interests. In fact, Hitler might even agree to cede certain territories in the East to the Kremlin, all in a bid to remove his greatest adversary from the battlefield. With the Soviet question settled, Berlin could then focus entirely on subduing Britain by securing full control over the Mediterranean, severing vital supply lines from the colonies to the North African front, and ultimately forcing the United Kingdom to surrender once and for all. The Allied forces in North Africa had become nothing more than sitting ducks, easy prey now that Germany was no longer entangled in the Eastern Front. The question was no longer whether they could hold the line, but how long they could last. Once the last Allied units were defeated, the German war machine was finally free to concentrate all its might on preparing Operation Sea Lion, the final blow to crush Britain. Before launching the invasion, however, Hitler would offer the British one last chance. Surrender, end the war, and establish a puppet fascist regime loyal to Berlin, much like Vichy France. Otherwise, Britain would be erased from the map. But for Winston Churchill, the answer was obvious. He and the British people would fight to the bitter end. Regardless of their courage, German forces would eventually land on British soil, achieving what had once seemed impossible. And thus, Hitler, the failed artist who once roamed the streets of Vienna, would finally see his grand ambition realized. Yet, when the war ends, a new question arises. Who will be the first to wield nuclear weapons? Because if either Germany or the Soviet Union obtained such power before the other, no treaty would prevent total annihilation. Still, just as in our own timeline, the United States would likely be the first to develop the atomic bomb. In the best-case scenario, Washington abandons its isolationist stance and issues a global declaration. If either of the two great powers fires the first shot, we will respond with nuclear force to preserve peace. But if America remains neutral, then the only way to avoid the bloodiest catastrophe in human history is clear. Both superpowers must achieve nuclear parity simultaneously. Only then could mutual deterrence maintain a fragile peace. And without American involvement, most Jewish scientists, fleeing Nazi persecution, would likely flee to the Soviet Union, not the US. As a result, Moscow might gain the upper hand in the nuclear race, perhaps even detonating an atomic bomb years before 1949. No matter the outcome, one truth is undeniable. Without the United States, the course of World War II would have taken a far darker turn, not just for Europe but for the entire world.